And so this evening, I'm very pleased to introduce Stephen Johnson. Mr. Johnson is the author of many previous best-selling books, ranging in subject matter from technology to psychology and history, including Where Good Ideas Come From, The Invention of Air, The Ghost Map, Everything Bad is Good for You, and Emergence, The Connected Lives of Ants, Brains, Cities, and Software. He's also the editor of the anthology The Innovator's Cookbook and writes for Time, Wired, The New York Times, and The Wall Street Journal. And you can follow him on Twitter as well at Stephen B. Johnson, named by Time as one of last year's 140 best Twitter accounts. The Boston Globe recently wrote, Johnson is a writer who thinks about ideas, where they come from and why they last. Over numerous books, he has charted the junction of innovation, technology, and history to show how good thinking emerges. In his new book on the subject, Future Perfect, Johnson explores how successful progress, particularly in our networked age, comes not from centralized businesses and governments, but from our peer networks. It is a hopeful, affirmative outlook for the future in an often pessimistic cultural and political landscape. A recent Wall Street Journal review states, if you're a pessimist, and chances are you are, you should read Future Perfect. In fact, read it even if you're an optimist, because Mr. Johnson's book will give you lots of material to brighten the outlook of your gloomy friends. We're very pleased to bring its author back to Harvard Bookstore tonight. Please welcome Stephen Johnson.
I like that. That quote from the Wall Street Journal was funny. It was like, if you're a pessimist, read it. If you're an optimist, you should also read it. If you're right in the middle, I think it's pretty much 50-50. You don't need to read it. So it's great to be back here. Thanks for coming out on a rainy night. I think I've been here for maybe every book except for maybe the first one. So this is one of those must go-to stops on the book tour. I want to tell you a little bit of the argument for this book, or just start telling you this slightly funny, amusing, somewhat embarrassing story that happened to me as I was finishing up with this book. As you heard, this is an optimistic book, and I've done a few NPR interviews recently since they came out where they've introduced me and they're like, the next guest is an optimist. Like it's like a giant panda we found. We didn't know there were any left, but look, there's one. And it has this opening preface. The large part of the argument of the book is about a kind of new political worldview and the structure of the peer network, which I'll get to in a second. But it has this preface about progress and about a problem we have in our society and a kind of bias we have, I think, largely in the media, against stories of steady incremental progress. Parts of society where something has gotten better, by 1% or 2% a year, reliably, year after year after year. Changes like that add up over a generation to really remarkable leaps forward that just don't get reported because there's no news. Because we'd much rather talk about some amazing new technological breakthrough, the new iPhone, or some catastrophic plane crash that happens somewhere, or disastrous thing that happens, or even incremental kind of regression. Slow and steady decline seems to be more newsworthy to people than incremental progress. And so I started the book just by pointing out that actually there are a lot of indices out there of our kind of social health that have improved mightily over the last 20 years. And one of them that I kind of have a little set piece about is aviation safety. It has gotten astonishingly safe to fly in an airplane. You are now more likely to die. You are more likely to be elected president of the United States in your lifetime than you are to die in a plane crash. We don't have very many presidents. I don't know if you've noticed that. And so I have this whole kind of discussion of this, but at some point, just to kind of express how safe it has become, I have this line where I say, if planes had gotten as fast as they have gotten safe over the last 30 years, it would now take 5 minutes to fly from New York to Paris. That's how the incredible track record of the safety, the commercial aviation system over the last 20 or 30 years. So I tell you all this because I have a now 11-year-old son, and about a month ago we were on vacation actually near here in Westport, Massachusetts, and the books arrived in all their orange day-glow splendor, and my son was like, "I'm going to read your book, Dad." And so he, for the first time, kind of picks up my book and starts to read it. And he he's flipping through it, and he seems to be genuinely reading it, and he's asking questions about what does this word mean and so on. And then at a certain point, he looks up and he says, "Hey, Dad, how far away are London and Paris?" I'm like, "Well, they're pretty close." And he's like, "So how long does it take to fly between them?" I was like, "Oh, about an hour." And he says, "Right. So what you're saying here, wouldn't flying from London to Paris be like 5 seconds instead of 5 minutes?" And I said, no, it says from New York to Paris. And he says, "No, it says from London to Paris." So I go over and I look at the book, and it says from London to Paris. And then I go back to my original draft, which says from London to Paris. I read it 20 times. My wife read it. My editor read it. The copy editor read it. 10 other people read it. Nobody caught this. I had typed London when I met New York, and nobody caught this until my son read it. And so I tell you this one as a confession up front. If you do get a chance to buy the book, we haven't, it's the first printing, we haven't fixed it yet, so there is an error. But I mostly tell you this to say that the period from, when kind of those rites of passage, the period from when your children are old enough to read you to the period where they're old enough to fact check you is apparently, it's about 10 minutes. That's about all you've got. So savor that. It just goes by like that. Anyhow, so the main bulk of the book, though, is an argument, and it's an argument for a kind of a way of viewing the world and interpreting the world and of changing the world that I have seen increasingly around me in people that I've been inspired by, and whose work I have been admiring for some time. And it has occurred to me over the years that a lot of these different projects and organizations have a shared sensibility to them, that are animated by a kind of a shared set of values that hasn't quite been classified yet, and doesn't fit exactly the kind of existing kind of models that we have for thinking about these things. And so this book is an attempt to kind of talk about their vision, tell some stories. It's not a book of abstract political theory. It's driven by a bunch of kind of narratives, and to try and kind of put a name and a kind of description to these disparate projects. The argument basically is it's layered, and it kind of has 4 rungs to it. I'm going to try and walk you through it, but there are lots of details, so it's still worth reading the book, and despite its flaws. And the first rung is this, that we've all agreed as kind of members of the society that there are kind of institutions out there that we can make a kind of shorthand reference to and know what we're talking about without getting into the details of each particular instance of that institution and how it works. So we can point to the marketplace, and we can point to the corporation, and we can point to government. And yes, it's true that federal governments and local governments are different. Governments from country to country are different. Yes, it's true that there are different kinds of marketplaces and different kinds of corporations. But for the most part, we can agree that a government and a corporation and a marketplace is a category that's kind of cohesive enough that it's worth using that as kind of general terms. And in large part, our kind of political value systems are built around the ratio that we think society should have of these different organizations, right? We think that there should be more government providing more of a safety net, doing long-term infrastructure building and so on if you're on the left, and if you're on the right, you think the government should get out of the way and the market should be unleashed to do all of its magical things, right? So our kind of political worldviews were built out of these big categories. So the first part of the argument is that there is another category. There is another kind of institution that belongs in that kind of pantheon, and that has been around for a long time, but it is now kind of more powerful than ever, and there is more kind of evidence for its power than ever before, and that's what I'm calling the peer network, kind of borrowing the peer-to-peer language from technology. These are decentralized networks without traditional leadership structures, where people often in in a kind of diverse exchange of ideas from different points of view and different perspectives come together to work on problems, propose solutions, select interesting solutions, and amplify them through the network, and kind of collectively, without traditional monetary rewards and without traditional property ownership of their ideas or their labor, end up making the world a better place. Okay. The finest example of this is in a whole host of technologies that have now become everyday parts of our lives. And this came up in the political conversation, earlier this summer, in the "You Didn't Build That" speech, President Obama's speech, which was until a week or two ago the most controversial speech of the presidential campaign. Now the 47% has wrested that mantle. But so when President Obama gave that speech, right after the line where he said, "You built a business, you didn't build that," which was a slightly mangled turn of phrase, that wasn't necessarily referring to the business, but when you get into pronoun reference problems in political debate, it's a sign that something has gone wrong. His next line after that was, "The government built the internet," which then enabled businesses to kind of build things on top of the internet. And a few weeks after that speech came out, actually the Wall Street Journal ran this kind of contrarian argument saying, actually, the government didn't build the internet. That's kind of an urban myth. And in fact, it's no accident that the internet languished for 20 years before the private sector got interested in it and started doing things with it and so on. And you can understand why there's this battle here. If you're on the left and you can show that the government, created this amazing platform that we're all using in all these different ways, then that's an argument for the continued relevance and importance of government. And if you can disprove that theory, that kind of version of history, then you can build a libertarian argument that actually the markets will continue to outperform and out-innovate the government. What's so interesting, though, about this debate is if you actually go back and try and figure out, well, who did really build the internet? Yes, the government gets a lot of early credit with the internet, not so much with the web and with a bunch of other technologies, but they did fund early research. But almost nobody who was building the core technologies and protocols in the internet was actually working for a government agency. It really came out of that decentralized peer review tradition of academia. It was really computer scientists working at lots of different organizations around the country and then around the world who were building on each other's ideas, improvising, pushing the network in ways that the government never kind of specified, and freely sharing their labors without any ownership of them, without any patents, without any license, building on this kind of networking set of networking protocols that eventually turned into the internet. And that was true of the web. That's been true of all the open source software movements like Linux that are powering so many things around the world. And of course, it's true of something like Wikipedia. Now, one way to think about this is actually not in the book, but I wrote a Times Magazine article about it last weekend. Imagine you were some kind of Dr. Evil and you could build a special magnetic pulse device that would cause all the peer network produced software to stop functioning in the world. You can't do this, by the way, so don't even try. But imagine you could, just a thought experiment. What would happen? The internet would stop working, the web would stop working, email would stop working, Wikipedia would go down, the stock markets would go offline, part of the energy infrastructure would go down, planes could theoretically fall from the sky. Every Android device would turn off. Every Mac OS and iPhone and iPad would go off because there's open source Unix in all those iOS and OS X devices. It would be a global event on the scale of a pandemic or something. It would be a huge, huge transformative event. That's how far this kind of peer networking technology has advanced in just 30 years. Now, we are completely dependent on it as a society. So if we were having this conversation in Harvard Square in 1971, let's say, if we could go back all the way that far back, and I got up here and said, there's going to be a collective, collaborative, open network of labor where no one is going to have traditional property ownership, and we're just going to kind of share our ideas freely with no patents. And I mean, a lot of you might have been nodding. But hey, I now live in Northern California. Most of you would be saying, I'm sure that's going to work great on your commune in Mendocino County with the baskets you're going to be weaving. But in the real world, we don't build things that way. If you want to build something big that really society is going to have to depend upon, you can't build it through this kind of collaborative, collective, open network, right? That's just not, you need a big government or you need a corporation, you need the private sector, you need. So we now know that's not true. We now can point to these things and we can say, hey, that kind of collaboration did work and we're now dependent on it. And so part of my kind of interest in this is not so much that I think the technology itself is liberating and that I think that, all the world's problems can be solved just by throwing people on Facebook. Probably would be better off if we spent a little less time on Facebook. It's that we can now point to the internet as a role model. And we can say the way the internet was built empirically worked and outperformed actually the top-down state solutions and the bottom-up market solutions. And it ended up creating something that precisely because it was open and kind of collectively produced turned out to be much more powerful and much more innovative in the long run. And opened up all these uses for the marketplace in the long run. Ended up being a big boon for capitalism. It wasn't like it was antagonistic to capitalism. So that's step one. There is this thing, the peer network, and it works. It can do things. It has built things. It is no longer a kind of abstract utopian theory. The second stage of the argument is this, that we can take those types of peer network technologies and we can apply them to other kinds of problems. So it's not necessary to just use peer networks to build technology platforms. What else can we do with them? Well, the best example of it recently in the success of this kind of approach is Kickstarter. Right? Kickstarter, the arts kind of creativity crowdfunding site that allows somebody who is trying to finish their album or trying to start a theater troupe or trying to kind of get a cool design for a watch out into the world, they can go onto Kickstarter and they can ask for backers for their project. And you can ask for $10,000 to finish it or $100,000 to finish it, and everyone can contribute small amounts of money. It is not an investment. If you back a musician on Kickstarter and they go on to have a #1 Billboard album and make millions, you will not see a dime of that, and that's part of the laws of Kickstarter, right? You can get little rewards, right? And a lot of the creativity of Kickstarter comes from people saying, oh, if you give $10, I'll invite you to my CD party. If you give $100, I will stand outside your bedroom window and serenade you with my acoustic guitar, whatever it is. But it basically said, let's take the problem of funding arts, which historically has been, solved by big government institutions like the National Endowment for the Arts or big philanthropic institutions like the Duke Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation. And let's create a much more kind of diverse, decentralized network of potential funders. The world is probably filled with people who would like to spend $50 contributing to an interesting art project just because they think it should be in the world. And so that was, again, one of these experiments where, like Wikipedia, where you would have said 5 years ago, that's a lovely idea, I'm sure that will make a great senior thesis, but no one will ever really do that to scale. Well, Kickstarter is now on track to disperse more money to artists than the entire budget of the National Endowment for the Arts. And it is 3.5 years old. So now the question is, it's not could the Kickstarter ever rival the NEA? No, the question is, could Kickstarter be 10 times as big as the NEA? And this is not, by the way, the argument that we should do away with the NEA or that the state has no role here. In fact, part of the argument is that this is a great opportunity for functions that used to be kind of top-down bureaucratic state functions. They could be structured this way too. It could be taxpayer dollars that are being allocated here. It's not just going to 1,000 points of light and letting the state wither away. I don't make that argument at all. But this kind of bottom-up structure can be applied both in the private sector, in the kind of middle ground philanthropic sector, or in the government sector. So that's using the technology to solve problems that are not just about technology. Then the third rung is it doesn't even necessarily have to be about technology. The kind of collaboration I'm talking about goes better with some technology. It's easier to do now thanks to the internet, but a lot of cases it's really just about groups of people coming together, sometimes face to face. In fact, one of the places where these systems work really well is in local communities and neighborhoods. Because when you get down to the kind of community level, the people who are the true experts in a neighborhood are the people who live there. The people who have the most clear sense of what is needed in their community, what the problems are, what the emerging solutions are the people who are kind of walking the streets and hanging out and observing things. And so when you create peer networks, networks of neighbors that empower them to kind of either solve the problems themselves or notify the authorities of what the problems are, you unlock a lot of intelligence and kind of local expertise that is embedded in every community around. the country. I'll give you one example, actually, again, that's not in the book. I'm giving you all these free examples that aren't in the book so that you'll still want to read the book. And it's something I stumbled across a few weeks ago, actually, which is a story about this guy, Mark Lakeman, who lived in Portland, Oregon. And this is a beautifully Portland, Oregon story, by the way, where I'm going next week. Wonderful town. So Lakeman lived in this kind of normal residential community, kind of in the outskirts of Portland, and there was a intersection near his house, and it was like every intersection, residential intersection around the country, it had 4 stop signs, and it belonged to the cars. Occasionally there'd be a biker going by because it's Portland, but it was completely anonymous. And he went on this trip to Central America, and he came back and he said, throughout human history, all these traditional cultures, the crossroads has been the kind of centerpiece of civic culture. The crossroads is where people get together and they have a shared identity and kind of collective space, and they kind of define their community. But I live by this crossroads, and it's just totally banal, and there's nothing interesting about it. And so he started talking to his neighbors about this idea, and he decided to kind of reclaim this intersection, and his idea was to paint it and have this giant, kind of, 70 foot by 70 foot kind of painting right at the intersection, which was kind of this strange rainbow psychedelia kind of thing. And so he got his neighbors to agree that this was a really good idea, and then they went to the Department of Transportation, and the Department of Transportation had this beautiful Orwellian line about it. They said, "You can't do that. That's public space. No one can use it." Really? So that was good. But eventually, actually, the mayor heard about it, and they ended up getting approval to do it, and so they painted the square. One of the streets is called Share-It Street, and they changed it to Share-It, so it's Share-It Square is the name they gave to it. And then they started adding these things around, and they added this 24-hour solar-powered tea station. God bless you, Portland. And a lending library for books where neighbors could drop off books and a few other things. And then they would have these kind of block parties where they'd gather on it. And it became this thing that everybody owned and was part of in the community. And it turns out other neighborhoods were like, we want one of those. And so they created this thing called intersection repair. And it was basically just a set of kind of instructions on how to kind of transform your intersection. And then they built an organization called City Repair on top of that. And it's now spread. There are all these intersections in Portland and Seattle and now kind of around the country. So next time you're driving along, you see some crazy painting in the middle of the intersection, you know where it came from. But here's the thing, to reclaim that community, they didn't rely on the local government. In fact, the local government said you can't do it for a while. And they didn't get Starbucks to come and build a coffee shop, right? They built this unique thing themselves, right? And the most advanced technology involved, besides the solar panels on the tea station, was the paint. It wasn't something that was complicated, but it was about this kind of bottom-up, self-organizing, decentralized network of neighbors that were sharing ideas and trying to improve where they live. So that's a third rung. It's not just a technology. It's not just a cyber utopian argument about how technology is going to save us. And the fourth part of the argument is this. If you believe, then, that these peer networks are real, that they've built things and can build new things, and they can be applied to solve all sorts of problems, and they can help governments do a better job, and actually there's a whole second argument about how corporations can be structured more like peer networks, which I won't get into. If you believe that this structure, this institution, or anti-institution is crucial to continuing the kind of march of progress, where do you belong on the political spectrum? Because people who believe in this, they take seriously the old libertarian kind of ethos that comes from Hayek and the Austrian school, which is that decentralized systems will often outperform centralized planned ones because the world or the economy or society or the city is too complicated for a bunch of kind of master planners in a room somewhere to understand. And the kind of libertarian argument for the power of markets is that it takes all that kind of information and distributes it through the entire marketplace. And so no one individual has to understand the totality of the system. Everybody is just understanding a little piece of it. That comes from Adam Smith through Hayek to today. And I think those of us who believe in peer networks take that seriously. We say, absolutely, that's right. That is true. The problem is that there are a whole set of problems that markets don't necessarily solve, or a whole set of problems that markets ignore, or a whole set of problems that markets create that need to be solved by somebody else. And we need kind of countervailing forces in society. And by the way, as decentralized as markets are, there is nothing as incredibly hierarchical and top-down as a modern multinational corporation. So there's kind of hierarchies inside of capitalism that we need to look at as well. But on the other hand, big government, top-down, kind of the heavy hand of the state is in some ways anathema to this worldview as well. So that traditional left-right, Democrat-Republican divide, well, it doesn't quite fit, right? And so what I'm trying to do with this book is to say that there are folks out there who believe in progress, and they believe in the kind of progressive values of kind of change and of kind of increased diversity and increased participation. But they also believe in the power of these peer networks. So I'm starting in this book to call these people peer progressives as a way of giving them a name. So that just the power of having kind of shorthand descriptions for things so that you can say, what if we tried a peer network here? Or I think the peer progressive position on this would be this, that, you know, don't underestimate the power of not having to spend 15 minutes explaining what you're talking about when you're trying to put a kind of a new idea to work. If you can build consensus around terms, that's really helpful. Whether these particular terms take off or not, we'll see. But I do think that the word peer itself is a very powerful one because it plays on both the technological level and it's a word that people just intuitively get. It's a jury of your peers, the respect of your peers. It's a very resonant word, I think. I'll just tell you one kind of last story that's maybe my favorite story that is in the book that captures a lot of these values. And it's a story in a way about a kind of a hybrid peer network, which is the 311 service that is in many cities. Is there 311 in Boston? Do we know? Okay. So the most kind of advanced version of 311, which I'll explain, is in New York City, my old hometown. And 311 does a number of different things, but basically it's a kind of information concierge for the city. So anybody can dial 3 numbers on the phone and they will get a live human being within 25 seconds. And they can ask questions or report problems. So they can call up and they say, hey, there's a pothole on my street, or the bar down the street is making too much noise, or is it alternate side parking, or I need a battered women's shelter, or I'm in the park and I need to know if there are any kids events here. I'm here with my kid. And what makes the system so powerful is that the citizens call in and they get their answers. They talk to a human being who knows the answers to these problems. They figured out statistically like 95% of the calls are answering a finite set of questions. And so people at the call centers know the answers and then they can route them to the people who don't. They speak 180 different languages, which is great. Different people speak different languages. But they've fielded 100 million calls as of 2 years ago or something like that. They did a customer satisfaction survey with 311 where they ranked it up against both private sector and governmental call centers as well to see how happy people were with the service. And 311 came out tied at the top with high-end hotels and retail chains. In the middle was the IRS, and at the bottom were the cable companies. Which seems about right? But the whole idea that this is calling a government agency, and people are like, I love it. I'm getting the greatest support. You know, normally you think about that, you're like, I went to the DMV today, and then I tried to kill myself because it was so awful. But here's what makes it so extraordinary. It's a two-way system. So the city takes in all these calls and all this data and uses it to create this huge dashboard of all the shifting, unpredictable, unanticipated problems and needs in a city of 8 million people. So every single call that comes in is tagged and geotagged so they can see, oh, there's a cluster of pothole complaints here. Oh, there's a lot of people complaining about noise here. Oh, there's a lot of demand for this service here that's being unmet. And so what it is trying to tackle the problem, which is a tremendous kind of information overload problem of, in a city of 8 million people, how do you tell where the problems are? Well, what 311 says is instead of hiring a bunch of people and putting them on the city payroll to go around and figure out what the problems are, look for the potholes, 311 says, let's deputize anyone who can dial 3 numbers on a phone and have them almost unknowingly be part of this solution and have them be out there, be the eyes on the street, to use the classical Jane Jacobs phrase, helping us get smarter as a city and solve these problems and point out things to us that we haven't even thought of. And so the story that I love in the book, which I experienced firsthand, I can testify to it, is this bizarre thing that started happening in 2004, which was that certain neighborhoods in New York City on the west side, right by the Hudson, would suddenly, on random days, begin to smell overwhelmingly like maple syrup. So people would be walking around, West Chelsea, and they'd be like, "Oh my God, pancakes! What is going on?" And they would walk for blocks and blocks, completely saturated with maple syrup. So this is New York post 9/11, right? So people are nervous. Like, is this a chemical attack, by the like Aunt Jemima wing of Al Qaeda, and so they're worried about this, and so that 311 had just started, and so they call in, and they're like, it smells like breakfast in the West Village, and so this, at first the 311 operator said, "What are you talking about? We have a crazy one." And then they sent out, people to test the air, and they found out it was fine. So they instructed the operators, if you get one of these calls, just tell them it's fine. They should enjoy the smell. And then it kept happening. And the Times wrote about it. Local bloggers would write about it, and it would pop up here, and then it would go away, and it would pop up here. And it was this bizarre thing. And the city started literally calling them maple syrup events. Capital M, capital S, capital E, which is like the worst thriller you've ever gone to, like the maple syrup event, just when you thought it was safe to go back to the West Village. And so they, so this went on for years, and then finally people inside of 311 said, "Wait a second, these are clues, right? We know when all the calls, we've got them all tagged. We know where they were coming from roughly in terms of neighborhoods." So they instructed the operators, the next MSE, to I can't say it with a straight face, to get exact coordinates of where people were, like which intersection they were standing in. And they went back, and for each outbreak, they looked at the prevailing wind for that day. And when they aggregated all this data, it turned out that there was a very clear vector that was pointing back to New Jersey. The smells were coming from New Jersey. They were nice smells. They were nice smells. I know people are from New Jersey here, and I'm not saying anything bad about it. And then they literally got in their little van and drove over the bridge and drove to that point on the map and looked up, and there was this industrial, like artificial flavor and taste plant that every now and then was processing the fenugreek seed, which is used in many cuisines of the world, but on an American supermarket, you're most likely to find it on the shelf where they sell fake, cheap maple syrup knockoffs. It was not a chemical attack. It was not a life or death matter, right? Thank God, right? But what I love about this story, and what I think is so kind of exciting about these kinds of approaches, these kinds of peer network approaches, is that when they were designing 311 and coming up with the potential kind of uses of the service, I guarantee you nobody said it should also be really good at detecting and tracing syrupy outbreaks in the city, right? But because they had decentralized the process, because anybody who noticed something unusual was able to kind of input it to the system, and they were able to then learn from all that data, it turned out to be extremely good at tracking down the source of a syrup outbreak. And that is the power of these kinds of systems, because there's so many more people involved. There's so many more people kind of pushing them in interesting directions. Think about how the web and so many technologies have been steered in new directions that Tim Berners-Lee and other people never dreamed of when they were inventing them. The power of these systems is that they can innovate precisely because there's so many people who are coming up with new uses and new applications. When you widen what Tim O'Reilly calls the architecture of participation. And in a funny way, that's kind of the way that I think about this book. This book is it was a fun one to write because in a way it's a book about something that hasn't happened yet, right? It's a book about a movement that's just kind of starting and just crystallizing enough that you can kind of point to it and try and convince people that it deserves its own name. But my hope is that whatever role it can play here is in kind of pushing the process along, or amplifying, or kind of bringing attention to some of these projects or some of these people, or giving a phrase that people can use as shorthand. What I hope is that 5 years from now, I'm going to look back and see all these projects created by people who either read the book or were inspired by the people I write about in the book, who have come up with solutions and new ideas and new applications of peer networks and peer collaboration that I hadn't thought of at all, or wasn't anywhere on my kind of roadmap. That will be the sign that something is really working here. So if you get a chance to read the book, that's great. If you get a chance to be one of those people, that's even better. Thank you very much. Thanks, it was interesting. I was in Milan 2 weeks ago, right before the book came out here, on this panel about innovation in Milan, and they were trying to kind of get this entrepreneurial culture going in Italy, and they were talking about the private sector in the United States. And one of the things they were saying, which is very true, particularly in kind of Silicon Valley culture, that is apparently completely lacking in Italian culture, is that people are terrified of failure. So in Silicon Valley, you wear your failed startups as a badge of honor. It's kind of like, yeah, I tried 3 incredibly stupid ideas before I started this other thing. Or we started our startup to do one thing, and then we ended up realizing that was dumb, and so we pivoted, as they like to say, and we started doing something else. And people expect that. And they know, the whole venture capital business is predicated on the idea that 90% of your investments will return $0, right? I mean, that's a pretty interesting sign of the commitment to failure that these things have. And so that experimentation, that willingness to experiment, and not just risk failure, but kind of embrace it some of the time. There's a great slogan from the tech sector, which is fail faster. You're going to fail. Just go through it a little bit faster so you can move on to learn from it and hopefully get it right the next time. And I think you're right that in the public sector, in government, it's very hard. I mean, the Solyndra solar investment from the government, the fact that it failed, I mean, I kind of looked at that and I was like, yes, the government is going to bet on, if the government's going to be involved in this and bet on experimental long-term kind of projects, because it's one of the things that governments can do is look longer term than the market, then of course some of them are going to fail and the taxpayers are going to lose money. But that's became a huge kind of crisis. So part of it is, I think, that's one of the places where, again, the tech sector is not the solution, it's a role model. And so that we can go into government now and we can say, look, we should be more tolerant of failure. Look at how well that works in this place. And in the private sector, let's try and bring that into government as well. But it's almost a kind of a narrative problem. You have to kind of tell enough stories and explain to people that they shouldn't be as afraid of it as, but at least we have that tradition here. I mean, the Italians were just like, we don't have it anywhere. We don't have nothing to point to other than, the United States. Yeah, so the idea of if you have this, the role of metrics and stats, you've got this incredibly huge dashboard, all this information flowing through it in the case of 311. And so whether the role of the kind of the person or people or the group that is kind of just sitting there, I would describe it as kind of pattern recognizers. But devoting people who are kind of just looking at the screen all the time being like, I'm not necessarily a specialist in potholes or syrup outbreaks. I'm just there to look for interesting things that are happening, whether positive or negative, so that I can let then the appropriate people know. I think that's a really interesting role. The other role that I would say that's important in this, and I think this is true of private sector organizations and public sector ones and government ones, which is, as I said, a big theme of this book, and indeed of my last book, Where Good Ideas Come From, also for sale. I'm an author on book tour, what can I do? Is the importance of diversity, and not the traditional multicultural diversity of social tolerance. You want to be around people who are different from you to be more tolerant as a society, which is a wonderful, laudable goal and an important one. But there's a different argument for it, which is that there are a whole host of studies that show that people who surround themselves with other folks who have different perspectives, and particularly different professions or fields of expertise, when they come together as a group, they actually are better at solving problems than smarter but more like-minded groups. Right? This is what Scott Page calls the diversity trumps ability theorem. Right? And in Good Ideas, I talk a lot about how so many innovations come from an idea that is kind of concocted in one field that gets borrowed and brought over into another field, or a technology designed for one purpose gets ported over and put to use in a new place. And that's a big driver of innovation. And so when you create hubs where different ways of looking at the world collide, you get interesting new combinations. And so part of the other role, there's the pattern recognizer, which is a kind of occupation I think is important in these systems. And then there's the connector, which is somewhat self-serving because it's kind of what I do for a living. But the person inside of an organization, for instance, that would go around, a large multinational corporation, for instance, would go around from department to department and talk to the engineers and talk to the marketing people and talk to the finance people and figure out, oh, you know what? The finance people are working on this one problem that's actually weirdly similar to the problem that the engineers are working on. And if we got these folks together, I bet there would be a really interesting conversation, even though superficially they seem to be made out of different stuff in a way. So those kind of pattern recognizers and those connectors, I think, are going to be, in these kinds of systems, are going to play important roles. The story I tell right at the beginning about aviation is this bizarre thing where I was on book tour for Invention of Air, and there was a USA Today in my hotel, and I opened it up, and they had this headline story about how, for the first time in the history of commercial aviation, the U.S. had gone 2 years without a fatal plane crash. And I thought, hey, finally, there's good news of incremental progress that is being reported, so this is great. So I was kind of guest blogging at Boing Boing, the wonderful blog, and so I said, I'll write a blog post about this. So I write up a little blog post about aviation safety and how we should have more stories like this, basically the spiel I just gave you. And within minutes of posting this, I started getting emails and texts from friends of mine saying, Stephen, a plane just crash landed in the Hudson. Like minutes after you put that post online bragging about aviation safety, like, you brought that plane down. And, actually it was kind of scary. And then it turned out that it was the miracle on the Hudson and everyone had survived. And so actually it turned out to be actually in defense of my argument rather than a critique of it. I joked that I was not going to write about aviation safety anymore, though, and that that post I was writing about how we had avoided any species extinguishing asteroids for a long time, I was going to also not write that one. But anyway, but then the way that the coverage happened with that was it became all about the superhero pilot, Sully, who was amazing, or it was the miracle on the Hudson, it was this miracle. But the unsung story, there was a wonderful book written about it, but generally, undertold, was the plane. The plane performed incredibly well, right? Those, you have a bunch of Canadian geese crashing your engines. They could have just blown up and shattered, and the plane would, would have exploded and crash landed. They survived it enough to keep enough power going. They didn't have any lift left, but they could keep the electronic system going. And that Airbus had this fly-by-wire system, which stayed intact, and which basically was assisting Sullenberg as he was landing the plane and gave him this, guidance at the right kind of angle of attack to land in the Hudson. And so how fly-by-wire got built is it was actually originally a NASA project, government-funded project, that then Airbus kind of learned from and tinkered with and built for the first time in the 320. And so thousands of people, actually, it's not crowdsourced like Wikipedia, but actually there were thousands of minds that were working on the problem of how do you build an electronic system to help pilots guide a plane, plus how do you build an engine that can survive, 10 Canadian geese colliding in it, or whatever it was, 6 Canadian geese. And they were part of the story too. I mean, they were just as important, but you can't put 1,000 engineers on the cover of Time magazine, right? And so we don't hear about them. And, in a funny way, in that Times Magazine piece, I wrote something that again, it's not in the book, but it occurred to me kind of after I was done with the book, which is when you talk about who built the internet and why we should care about that story. One of the reasons is, well, because it's peer networks, and peer networks can do all these other things, which we've talked about. But the macro point is that we lack great kind of master narratives in our society about large mass-scale group collaboration. We have great stories of Steve Jobs and Thomas Edison. And when we talk about group collaboration, we talk about civil rights movement and things like that. But in terms of mass collaboration, actually building things, we don't have stories like that because it's harder to tell the story that way. But in fact, a lot of things around us were built in that way. And if we want to have more progress, we want to have more innovation, we want to create systems that support that kind of collaboration. And the internet is maybe the greatest story that we can point to and say, we built that. And so I think even in the case of planes, there is, there is some version of that kind of networked intelligence at work in the planes themselves. Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say that the other thing I talk about is the chicken gun, right? So they test the jet engines. Every model of jet engine that is made is tested before it can go on commercial planes, where they have this kind of pneumatic gun that shoots frozen chicken carcasses into the spinning engine to show that it won't explode. It can fail, but they don't want it to just literally blow up and kind of take down the whole plane immediately. And so they sit there firing these chickens and more chickens that sacrifice their lives to do this. But that was part of the success of it. That was the first step, and that was your taxpayer dollars at work, right? But no one presented it that way. They just presented it as magic superhero Sully. Sully's going to come after me before I talk about this. Yes, sorry. I guess there are two things to say. The first is that let's just take it as a given that these are tools that can be used for good and for evil, right? I read about this a little bit in the book. When I wrote my book Emergence, which was kind of the first thing that I'd written about decentralized systems, it was a very, again, upbeat book, and it was about these kind of decentralized networks, not about politics so much. And it literally came out on 9/11. And I'd written this book about decentralized networks, and suddenly we'd been attacked by a decentralized network, and we were at war with a decentralized network instead of with the state. And I'm not a fan of Al Qaeda, right? I mean, they were using it for evil. But it doesn't mean that the technology is totally neutral. I think that the fundamental premise here is that if you build tools that are more democratic, if you build forms of media that are more democratic, if you widen that architecture of participation, in the long run, just as with democracy itself, in the short run, when you open up the gates, suddenly you're like, oh my God, there's so many crazy people who now have a voice, or there's so many cranks, or there's so many, kind of scam artists that are out there. But if you design those systems right, and if you create, again, those kind of selection processes and ways for the system to assign value to contributions, so that it's not just a free-for-all, which takes time and takes tweaking, and Kickstarter, for instance, is constantly tweaking the way that it works to make it work better. But in the long run, involving more people in the process will trend towards better ideas, better solutions, in the same way that we've decided, as most of the world, that democratic systems, for all the craziness that they introduce, are better in the long run than the centralized ones without democratic kind of elections. So I think there is reason kind of for optimism. And Wikipedia is a great example of it. I mean, and people always point to the news media is much more likely to point to the case where somebody said something libelous or some crazy entry appeared in Wikipedia. And they're like the plane crashes of the encyclopedia world. In fact, the real story is the fact that 99.9% of the time Wikipedia actually works pretty well and is far more comprehensive than any encyclopedia ever in the course of human history. And that's because they've been tinkering with the model of how to make it work and how to correct, how you kind of correct entries and how you empower people to write things and encourage them to write things. And they've been tinkering with that model for whatever it is, 12 years now. So I think these systems can steer towards these directions, but we have to choose that. We have to choose what our goals are. And there will be cases where people build peer networks that are nefarious, for sure. But that doesn't mean that it's not a tool that most of us should embrace, because most of us don't have nefarious aims, I hope, except in this room, because you all seem a little sketchy. I am sure there are going to be places where the peer network kind of runs up against the limitations of the structure. I think in all those areas you just mentioned, I can think of at least one place where I think an existing peer network has been applied in a useful way, but I will not tell you about any of them. No. I mean, one very clear thing in terms of wealth inequality, which is one very regressive trend of the last 20 or 30 years. I have a whole chapter in the book called Conscious Capitalism, there's a book coming out called Conscious Capitalism 2 that is worth reading and that I haven't written. But it's a study of a lot of these companies that basically had kind of peer network architecture in the way that the corporations were structured. And that involved much less hierarchy, both in terms of decision making and in terms of compensation. And so it's everything from Whole Foods to Google, and they looked at kind of 30 of these companies that had empowered their employees, got rid of the vast hierarchy between the top and the bottom of the company, empowered all the employees in the stores to make creative decisions on a local level and make their stores kind of unique, and limited the high-low ratio of CEO to kind of bottom of the chain. So instead of the average U.S. company is 400 to 1, and these companies are all about 20 to 1. So a big, order of magnitude improvement plus. And what they found in these companies were outperforming their competitors on the S&P 500. So it wasn't just a good thing to do. It was actually a smart thing to do business-wise. And you can understand why, because there's much more intelligence and fluidity and adaptability, and happy employees creates a much better company. So there's economic sense there. So you can use this kind of peer progressive argument to actually start to tackle the wealth inequality problem by speaking to the companies themselves and saying, listen, in the long run, it's better business for you and your shareholders if you reduce these, for instance, the income gap. So I think there's stuff on education in the book as well. I'll say one thing though, because I've been very upbeat, and I just want to leave you on a down note. No, it's an open question, and it's actually one that kind of has come to me since the book came out. It's a lot of things. The book has been out for a week, and I'm coming up with all these things, which I'd love for you all to think about and prove me wrong. But the question I have about these systems is, are they capable of long-term thinking? Because that is definitely one place where the state has historically outperformed the marketplace. Companies tend to like to think on the scale of like a quarter, maybe a fiscal year. And there are a lot of needs or issues or problems that we have in society that require 10-year thinking or 50-year thinking when we're thinking about populations or climate change or energy. My friend back in California, Stuart Brand, started the Long Now Foundation so that people would think on the scale of 10,000 years, because that's the way people think in California. And so is it, given that they're decentralized, is there something in the peer network that's kind of more like the market in that sense of everybody can come together in their neighborhood and say, we need this now. We need a playground here now. Let's make it happen. And by golly, we're going to get together and make it happen. It's fantastic. First time I've said by golly at a reading in a really long time. But are they able to say, like, actually, what's the 50-year plan for this? And that's one thing that master planners are good at. I think about cities. They're very good at saying, we don't need this bridge right now, but we're going to need it in 20 years. We can tell that. And so let's, while we've got the money and while we've got the time and while it's not going to disrupt things, let's build the bridge now so that we can be ready for our needs in 20 years. I would love to be proved wrong. It may well be that people are clever enough to, kind of engineer networks that can think in that scale as well. It's entirely possible. I just don't have a great example of it yet. So, and it's not that these institutions are going to, it's not that I'm calling for overthrowing the state. I think and a lot of times we're going to see hybrids. 311 is a hybrid. It was actually built by the state, and there is a command center. I've been in the command center. But what makes it a peer network is the kind of reporting structure of all the people out on the street. So a lot of times you're going to have kind of borrowing some of these tools without replacing the big institutions. All right, thank you all so much for coming out. Really great conversation. Happy to sign.